looks like it's 1:31. We still have more folks coming in, but in sake of staying on schedule, let's go ahead and get started, and they can join us in mid-presentation. My name is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions, and on behalf of OTA, we welcome you to the Oilfield Strong webinar series. As you know, we've been doing this for a couple of years with a lot of fantastic topics, I think. If you do miss any of these, or if you, after watching this, if you want to share it with anyone in a day or so, it'll be on our YouTube channel. Just go onto YouTube and look for OTA compression, and that will lead you to our YouTube channel. As I laugh every now and then, it's kind of amazing that a environmental service, oilfield service company has a YouTube channel and is doing a webinar, but that tells you how things have kind of changed in today's world. But we have embraced it, and very happy to have our speaker today that is really embracing it and the use of data. I'd like to introduce Gani Sagingaliyev, who is the co-founder and CTO of ESG Dynamics. He has a degree from Texas A&M and AMP from the Duke Fuqua School. Has great experience coming from majors, I think with Chevron, and then more of an independent, Mantitarka, and then his own startup funded by Quantum Energy. So he's seen the oil industry from various perspectives, and now is starting up ESG Dynamics to focus on the data side of business. I know on other webinars, we've talked about the importance of data in the industry, but also specifically for ESG. Well, here's a company that's really taking it to bear and is really focusing on that. We look forward to a presentation he's going to make. I know normally y'all are familiar that it's kind of a discussion back and forth, and we'll have some of that, but then there's a presentation that he wants to make on specific flaring trends, which I think will show the power of this tool that ESG Dynamics has created. So with that, Gani, welcome to the Oilfield Strong webinar, and appreciate your time. If you would, let's start off with kind of that. I always start off with that softball question: that why does the world need ESG Dynamics? What is it about data, and what is your objective that you're trying to achieve by creating this company and focusing on the data?
Well, Grant, thank you for having me and inviting me to this webinar. Glad to be here. I am a petroleum engineer, and I've been in the industry for over 15 years. I'm here in Houston, Texas, and today I do speak on behalf of ESG Dynamics. And ESG Dynamics is a data and intelligence platform and a web portal for our clients where they can interact with that data. And we're currently focused predominantly on upstream and midstream related greenhouse gas emissions, related data, intelligence, and analytics. And today we'll talk a little bit about the Permian Basin flaring trends, but you're right, let's create a little context and talk about what we do and why we do it. We know that access to energy security equates to economic well-being, and that oil and gas is going to be in the energy mix for the long term. At the same time, the industry needs to continue to decarbonize. We need to eliminate the fugitive emission sources, and we need to bring transparency around our performance and around that data. And there are good players and there are not so good players in the oil patch, as in any industry. And we need to learn to differentiate them, and we need to give the power of that data to a wide variety of stakeholders so they can make ESG friendly decisions and help push the entire performance of the industry forward. And it all starts with data. So access to that data. For instance, as an operator, you can never know how good or bad you are unless you can benchmark yourself or compare yourself against others. As an investor or a holder of portfolios, you should be able to differentiate the different components of your portfolio And sometimes portfolio holders are parties that we don't necessarily think of as portfolio holders, like ranchers and mineral owners and landowners. They are holders of portfolios, and they need to know what's happening over their properties. And that's the type of data that we want to provide to our clients. So it's useful data, not just data, but data they can use to make decisions and make decisions relevant to kind of what they're doing. Another component of that is, frankly, affordability. There's a scarcity of platforms like this that provide the data in the marketplace. And when we think about that market, it's not only limited to the few thousand players that can pay $50,000 a year for data. It's much larger than that. The pool of stakeholders is enormous. And one of our key overarching objectives is to bring this high quality data, service, intelligence, analytics to our clients, but also at an unbeatable and affordable price. And that way, we can engage all of these stakeholders to make, with their decisions, drive the industry performance forward. That's kind of what we're about. And when, let me fast forward with a few slides here, just talk about ESG Dynamics again. When we think about where we are today, we just started. We just launched about 3 weeks ago, went live with our initial set of modules. We call them energy modules. And we're probably in the second inning of where we want to be ultimately. So currently we've got the production module where folks can come in and quickly find their peers, right? If I'm a producer that makes 5,000 barrels of oil a day, I want to see, well, who else is in that group that I can benchmark myself against. So that's the production module. It allows you to do that real quick. And then we have the flaring and fuel gas module where now we can, again, compare that performance by the rate, intensity, emissions between different players, between different portfolios. And if we combine that with the combustion related emissions from DNC related activities, that usually makes up about 80, overwhelming majority of a company's emissions. So that gives a good taste for where I stand as an operator or where my portfolio stands. Also, we have the wells module, and it's very relevant to a lot of folks where you can come in, and if you're a ranch owner, for instance, you can take a look at a distribution of wells on your property that are inactive, be it TN8 or PN8 wells or plugged wells, see how long they've been in that status, see the distribution of that, as well as who the operators are that are responsible for that. Or maybe there's no responsible party today that we know of. So those are important pieces of intelligence that we provide. And given the opportunity, I'll tell that what's coming soon as well. We've got the EPA data coming in as a benchmarking module over the next month. And then we'll be adding a lot of environmental regulatory norm violation related data as well. So it's about to get a lot more enhanced.
You mentioned ranch owners, and I would think they really would like to know what type of inactive wells are on there, but it also seems like this could be really useful from a due diligence side to be able to understand what you're buying. But I guess you've also talked about portfolios and being able to compare either how your company is doing relative to others or how a portfolio is doing relative to others. Is that all? I assume there's a whole variety of uses for something like this.
Yes, of course. And I'm actually glad you're mentioning A&D. I've been on that side, right? On the acquisition side, when you're looking at several deals every week, and it's very intensive on your team to do that. And the first thing that you always focus on is usually the performance, right? Is this asset performing as good as I want it to be? Does this align with my objectives? And things like that. And then somewhat down the road, you get to the, hey, how much liability am I potentially picking up here? And that's always in that VDR or data room where you can get to that. And if you get to that toward the tail end, you invested all this time already to look at it, to evaluate it. And then you find that, oh man, there's so much liability here. This is really not something I want. With our platform, you can put that at the front end. Spend 10 minutes looking at the asset, figuring out if that's something you're okay with. tackling, or maybe it's not a big issue for you, or maybe it is, and then you say, man, I'm not going to spend money and time on this and my team's energy, and we'll move on to something else. So that's a great tool for that, or for any type of due diligence work, portfolio wise as well. And as we go through the webinar, we'll talk a little bit about benchmarking and comparing different operators in the Permian related to flaring and things, and you'll get a taste for what the tool can do.
You brought up benchmarking because, if I understand this right, you're not trying to create a score for a company. There's a lot of people, MIQ and Project Canary and others, that are trying to come up with a rating system. Is that right? This isn't the rating, but it's kind of the data behind it. But then through benchmarking and trend analysis, you can help guide.
Correct. We're not trying to score companies or give them a green, yellow, red flag or anything around that. We're providing data that can enable that. We reserve no judgment, but we want to give our clients the tools to make conclusions on their own and make that very easy and quick to do.
Okay. Well, why don't, I know for this webinar you put together some information on flaring, and I think you have some other intelligence that you've done that you've got posted on your website. So later on we'll give the website so people, well, it's there on the slide, so if people want to go and look at that and see. But why don't you run through a couple of the pages here so you can people can kind of see what this tool does and how you can use it, and we'll kind of talk from there.
Let's do it. Let's jump into the Permian Basin flaring journey. And what you're looking at here, and this is a lot of information on the slide, and I apologize for that, but you're seeing 4 different snapshots in time from 2018 through Q2 2021 in terms of flaring. And on this map, you're looking at bubbles in terms of size, that's flaring rate by lease, and the color is the intensity. And if we begin our story in Q1 2018, and maybe we should have started earlier than that, because when you look at it, the Delaware Basin was already in trouble in the beginning of 2018. Through 16 and 17, there's been frenzy of drilling, development, delineation activities in the Delaware Basin. It was a very active place to be. And I was drilling wells in 16 in the Delaware Basin, and infrastructure was an issue. It wasn't readily available in all places. So a lot of the times, with the basin being oilier initially in the initial development areas, the main product was oil. So a lot of times gas would be flared for longer than it should, and we would be waiting on infrastructure. So by the time 2018 came to a close, we're flaring at close to 700 million a day in gas in the Permian Basin. And I mean, putting that into context, that's enough to power 3 million households in the US and 30 million in India, right? So it's an enormous amount of energy that's been, without proper use, if you will. And then we move into 2019 and things get worse before they get better. As you can see, Midland Basin is now flaring over 200 million a day. And collectively between the two basins, and we're close to 200 BCF of gas flared in 2019. Now, luckily, September comes about, and the Gulf Coast Express, I think, came online with 2 BCF a day takeaway capacity, much needed relief brought to the basin. And you can see that toward the tail end of the year, production is still ramping up. And we'll look at the trend of production here in a second. Production is still ramping up, and then flaring starts to slightly subside. So we see more takeaway. That was much needed relief again. And if we look at Q1 2020 and then Q2 2020, that's when really a significant shift happened. And first of all, we hit the pandemic. and early pandemic shut-ins happened. And drilling and completions activity dropped off by close to 60% between the quarter-over-quarter, and the flaring rate dropped off by about 50%. So several things happened. Obviously, with the development activity slowing down, there was more capacity for gas takeaway. Again, with development activity slowing down, you're seeing less flush production coming in. And a lot of times those early flowback days when perhaps your facility is not hooked up yet, a lot of flaring can take place. Now that it's not a general rule for everybody, so it varies by operator, obviously. And as we go from 2020 to 2021, now takeaways is not an issue. So if there's routine flaring happening, it really doesn't have to happen, first of all, and perhaps it's localized with local takeaway constraints or maybe local infrastructure constraints. But on the macro scale, we've effectively debottlenecked the basin. So
you're doing this for the industry as a whole, but could you also do this for individual companies or portfolio of companies to show how this has progressed?
Yes, of course. We could have looked at the same map by operator.
Okay.
We're not going to do that today, obviously, and there are a lot of operators involved here. But yes, that's something we can definitely do. And in a second here, we'll look at the top 50 producers in the Permian Basin and look at how they're doing in terms of these key metrics.
Okay.
So let me talk about the trends here for a second. So this is the same data we just looked at, the same 4 years, but now you're looking at the oil rates. At the top, you got the gas rate, the flaring rates, and then the flaring intensity. And you can see that 2019 was the worst of it, when Waha was, at zero. Maybe we saw some negative territory for a little bit, but there's been a significant blowout in differentials between Waha and Henry Hub at that time. And what we can see, that significant drop that I was talking about here in Q2 went from about 500 million to about 200 million in flaring quarter over quarter. And several things were obviously responsible for that, as I mentioned prior. Interestingly, if we overlay development activities there, and here we're pulling this from our platform as well, drilling and completions activity counts, you see those counts drop off significantly, and they're staying down, though we're seeing some recovery in late 2020 and early 21, not nearly close to where we were. And if we just take the completion side of that, which talks to new production coming online, then there is some correlation between flaring coming down and the completion activity counts coming down as well. So
this is all interesting in that of kind of the activity, but doesn't this also, I think the completion and flaring, doesn't that make up a huge chunk of the greenhouse gas calculation? Can't that be used for this as well?
Yes, of course. We could have looked at these same trends in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent emitted via these flaring activities. That's not something I'm going to show here today, but that's certainly the data we have. We have an internal algorithm that we use to translate all of these metrics into emissions.
Well, the reason I ask, obviously, so much pressure is out there to calculate or to tell what your greenhouse gas or your CO2e is. And so it seems like this product allows for that. Yes,
especially the relative metrics, right? Around, hey, how many kilograms of CO2e do I have per BOE produced? And we're seeing those metrics come up in a lot of the sustainability reports. And it's a good way to look at things. And a lot of times we're surprised by how much certain activities contribute to that total operator footprint.
And is that right, that flaring and kind of drilling completion make up, I said 80%, I'm kind of throwing that out, but it's a huge chunk of the greenhouse gases, those two areas.
Correct. It varies by operator, obviously.
Sure.
And the key components are going to be flaring, any combustion, be it diesel or gas for fuel gas purposes. Those will make up a lot. And then, of course, you've got pneumatic devices, you got things like atmospheric tanks, venting, and those will collectively make up the overwhelming majority of associated emissions. Of course, this is not taking into account any fugitive sources like malfunctions around flares and stuff.
Okay.
So an interesting trend going forward will be, just to finish up on this slide, that what's going to happen as activity picks up. And I think that the industry has adapted enough and has done enough progress that we will see activity pick up, but we're not going to see the flaring pick up in correlation with that, especially now that takeaway is not an issue, right? And I think we're seeing that a little bit. Activity is picking up. It's hard to see now, but I think over time we'll see a clearer trend. Activity is picking up, but flaring is still slowly trending down. So I think there's a lot of effort being put forward to make sure that that's happening. And I can never talk about flaring alone. I always have to talk about fuel gas as well. It's a very important metric that we don't talk as often as we talk about flaring, and for obvious reasons. What is fuel gas? It's simplistically gas used to power oil field needs, be it generators, compressors, ESPs, any artificial lift, and any other equipment. And it's not a binary 1 and 0 between flaring and fuel gas. Flaring's bad, fuel gas use is good. It's more like emissions-wise 1 and 0.85, because combusting gas is still very emissions intensive, though of course the energy is used for it's useful energy that's brought forward versus non-value added like flaring. But still, it's an important metric to pay attention to. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is that what happened in April last year, as flaring dropped off, fuel gas overtakes flaring as the number one gas usage area in the basin. And since then, as flaring falls off from 300 million to 200 million a day, we see fuel gas go the other way from 270 to 365. So that 100 million swing kind of went from one category to the other in a way. Not directly, obviously. But what's happening? Why is the intensity going up and the rate going up while the production is not ramping up that quickly? And that's because fuel gas is less tied to development activities and obviously more tied to your base production. So is declining base production necessitating higher and higher power to keep things flowing? And
this also speaks to, you hear about the electrification of the industry. This would kind of indicate that might not be really happening. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think there's partial electrification. There are inherent issues with the grid, the reliability, and certain things, from a reliability perspective, folks are going to be hesitant to use the grid versus running something on location. On the other hand, when we talk about the power needs, let's just talk about generators for a second. The largest ones maybe being 1,000 kilowatt capacity. They run at mid-20s in terms of their efficiency. Now you take a gas-powered power plant with a 2-stage system, and the efficiency of that plant would be over 50%. So in that context, electrification makes a lot of sense. You stretch that same volume of gas that much farther, and then we're not even talking about the surface footprint, vibration, noise, all of these environmental factors, right? So there's a case to be made for further electrification where possible in the basin, and that would make a significant dent in the right direction with oil field related emissions.
Very good, thank you.
So do you want to look at the top 50 operators and perhaps
I think
do a little bit of benchmarking?
I don't know if some of the operators might want to see the lists, but I guess let's look in it and we'll see who I'm about to make mad by showing this list, but
How many listeners will drop off from the webinar? Well, let's take
exactly.
a look.
It's there goes all my sponsors.
Well, what we're looking at here is the top 50 producers by gross operated production in the basin as of May of this year, so a few months old. These producers make up 91% of all the production in the Permian Basin, and they account for a disproportionately somewhat lower flaring of 76%, and then they make up about 92% of the all the fuel gas that's used. And if we break it down into several groups, we got the top 10 that are mostly public companies. We got the lower 10 that are mostly private, and then we got the middle 30. That's a good mix of both public and private companies. And you see a quick view, map view of public versus private in terms of flaring rates and intensities and fuel gas rates and intensities. That's just for a little bit of context of what the different footprints look like. And generally speaking, you'll never see crazy fuel gas rates on leases, but you can see them consistently through the basin. And what we can do.
I see that at least 3 attendees on here, their companies are listed on here. So that's, I don't know if that's good or bad. So I guess I'll wait and see if I get emails or phone calls from them. So, but I guess that's the point though. This data is out there, and if you're not providing it, someone else is going to be seeing it. So it is what it is. And so we either need to work to grind it down or to improve it.
Correct, of course. And again, we're just showing the data, and we're going to have a little bit of interesting discussion about this, though. So let's look at the top 10. Let's look at that group first and see how they're doing. What I've added here next to the top producer chart is the top 50 by flaring intensity of that same group of 50 and fuel gas intensity. And what we can see is that the top 10 producers on average are achieving lower flaring and fuel gas intensity rates, which is somewhat makes sense because they have a larger footprint. There are more operational efficiencies that can go into play, and obviously being public companies, there's a lot of focus on ESG today, and we see these metrics improve significantly. If I showed you this same graph as of 2 or 3 years ago, it would look much different than it is today. And within the group, there are obviously a couple of outliers and a couple of groups that I would point out that are doing a fantastic job. And I would point out, for instance, EOG being the number 3 producer. They are one of the lowest by flaring intensity. And mind you, they're also an oily producer. We'll usually see that the gassier producers tend to flare less because that's their main product.
Sure.
And the oilier producers perhaps would flare a little more sometimes. So EOG,
and I think that's an important thing too. This is a Permian Basin, but you could do the same for Barnett or South, because to compare a Barnett player to a Delaware Basin player, that's not fair to either side. You kind of have to, because one's a gas producer and one's a oily with gas condensate.
Correct. And actually, if we look at the Barnett or we'll look at the Haynesville, you'll see that there is not much flaring to speak of.
No, because it's their product. Yeah.
Correct. But the important part of that observation is that truly shows you what can be achieved. Right? If you treat every flow stream, be it oil, gas, or water, as a main product, you can achieve very high marks in all environmental aspects. And when you look at pure gas plays, you see that because they take care of their main product. So this is just a quick way again to do this, and it's tough to benchmark 50 operators, obviously, because of the wide range of production rates and all. So thus we broke it down. And another company I wanted to point out here is also Cimarex. Actually, I like their performance in combination, flaring and intensity. They're doing quite well. Actually, I think I have a slide where I point them out. There they are.
One, Gani, a question that's come on is talking about flaring and emissions. And, you know, it's always people are trying to make sure that the right wording is being used. But if you would kind of explain what you mean by both of those, flaring intensity and emissions, just so that everyone has a context for your presentation.
Correct. Well, I think everybody likely understands flaring, which is natural gas flared for numerous reasons, including safe oil field operations on occasion, right? And the intensity, there are several ways to calculate that. Here we talk about it in the context of ratio of gas flared to gas produced. And we were doing that same with fuel gas intensity, ratio of fuel gas used to gas produced. Of course, nobody was going to buy back gas to flare, but sometimes you will buy back gas to use for fuel gas usage. So,
right.
Those are little details we need to understand around these ratios as well.
Okay, thank you.
And in terms of emissions, not all gas is created equal. We've got different types, the heavier, the lighter types, and obviously their emission profiles differ. So the lighter gases that are close to purely methane will carry a lower emissions profile than those that are a bit more heavier in the chain.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yes, and what we can do is perhaps look at the lower 10 and see if we see a different potentially trend here. These are mostly private producers, smaller. The ratio between the top and the lower 10 is 20 to 30x in terms of production rates. And as the general rule here, we're seeing that the intensities around flaring and fuel gas are slightly higher. They tend to gravitate to the top of the top 50, and there are several reasons for that. Obviously, these are smaller operational footprints. There's perhaps less operational efficiencies, which is inherent to smaller players. Part of it could be less focus on ESG. I'm not going to say if it is or not, but the data is what it is, right? And though out of this group, I'd like to point out a few companies that I think are doing a really good job, and that's one of them is Lux. Relative to their peer group, it's the flaring intensity in combination with fuel gas intensity is pretty good. It tells me that they're taking electrification fairly seriously, and their fuel gas intensity at half the rate of the Permian aggregate, which is pretty good, I think. I'll obviously point out a few operators that I think are high in terms of their flaring, at least as of second quarter this year, and probably have some room to improve, and that's NBC and Rose Hill. As well as we've got a few operators that are just kind of gravitating toward the bottom near those zeros, and I'm giving them a blue flag. So that could either be a golden flag saying, hey, you guys achieved zero, fantastic. But I've looked at some of the trends, and when I see a flat line for 4 years, especially with the roller coaster we just talked about in the Permian Basin, perhaps there's something with the data that needs further attention. I'll just leave it there.
Well, because I look at that did stand out that these are zero. That would mean, in one way, great. That means I assume they're not flaring, they're not using fuel gas. But then, just as a petroleum engineer, also, it's like you go and it's like, there's got to be some flaring or some. So is that, yeah, that is confusing why that would be zeros on that. Is that just
right.
a reporting issue?
It could be a reporting issue. And, some operators are truly getting close to zero. But when you look at the trends, you see the path. You see the torturous path that they took to get there, right? And you see those trends. And when you see zeros and maybe a blip here and there, then that's a slightly different story, and especially on both metrics, right? With some operators, I've noticed that there's good reporting in, let's say, one part of the operation and the other is not. So those are among the top 50 that are not flagged. So there are a few. I'm not going to point them out today, Grant, because I think I'm already digging a hole deep enough.
Yes.
As it is.
No, and I'm not trying to pick on anyone, but you look at it and just see that. So, and I'm sure there's different stories for different companies, but the problem that I've visited with the Environmental Defense Fund before just to see their perspective, and they talk about how bad the oil fields data is, but and that's why they want to have cameras and all this, but this data is what we have, and so being able to improve it and then being able to compare it, at least that gets us a little of the ways there, even if they don't necessarily like our data. So, but if those folks aren't reporting or there's an issue, then we need to improve that as an industry so that we can stand by the data that we have and try to tell our story in a positive way.
I agree. And, especially when it comes to gas, we have fantastic measurements around gas, right? It's not a problem of having the data around the rates reporting or consistent reporting, or as we've seen a lot of A&D activity happen over the years past and slowed down a bit now, of course, but as assets change hands, as operators change hands, things sometimes fall through the cracks, and that could lead to underreporting or just missed reports sometimes. And we're seeing that in the data. It's I'll be frank, it's quite obvious with operators that have those issues.
So Gani, I think you have one or two more slides, but we normally go around 30-40 minutes, and I know people will start falling off. So if people want to talk to you about this or communicate with you, use this as, if you tell them how to reach you. And then for the audience, I think Gani still has another 10-15 minutes that he's available for to go over. I don't know if you have that many more slides or not, but we can keep the conversation going. But just since people might start falling off because we normally go 30-40 minutes, why don't you share how, if you want them to reach you or gripe at you for where their rating is, then how do they do that?
Right, of course. Several ways to reach me. Obviously, there's a website at the lower corner of the slide at esg-dynamics.com, and you can reach out for the contact us and request a demo. You can contact me directly at Gani@esg-dynamics.com. That's my email. You can follow us on LinkedIn at ESG Dynamics, and we will be posting more intelligence around certain deals or things that we think would be interesting for our followers and the industry in general to have bits of intel around. So that's a good way to keep track of our activities, and also leave us comments around those posts on topics that are of interest to you, and we'll read those, and we'll cater to our next intelligence report to topics of most interest.
Okay. And just for clarification, nothing like kind of regarding your business model, your revenue model, all this research and intelligence is, and you've got some on your website, but your business model is really a subscription based so that people can pull up and get data for themselves. And it's not necessarily this research stuff, is it? Or is it?
Correct. We do provide a web portal for our clients. It's a subscription-based model, so you kind of acquire a license, and then you have access to our entire database, and which is constantly being improved, and it's growing. And we are obviously, as I stated at the very beginning, here to make sure that more folks have access to this data at affordable prices. I mean, that's our overarching objective here.
Okay. So there you got the commercial in there. So why don't we keep going with your presentation? I don't know how many more slides you might have, but and then folks, if you need to fall off, obviously do that, or we've got a few more minutes here to talk, see what he has here and keep talking to him.
What I'll do is I'll just jump to one of the final slides here and here, this one. This is good. This is a slide for you, Grant, to invite me back in a few months to another webinar so we can talk about a different topic, which we didn't cover today, and that's around inactive wells in the industry, but here specifically in the Permian Basin. We have a vast amount of inactive wells, various years of inactivity and being in that status. Here, we're not going to currently look at who those operators are or where the most problematic areas are in the basin, with, as you can see, thousands of wells being in inactive status over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Now, what's the plan, right? With 40,000 shut-in OTA wells in the basin, over 30% of them have been inactive for over 10 years. And we're also tracking certain intelligence around transactions that take place where we see big shifts in those liabilities. Today it's with company A, and then you see 1,000 wells change hands. That's an interesting dynamic in the basin. Also, different jurisdictions, if you will, show different type of trends. Can you make out the border between Texas and New Mexico? I think it's pretty obvious, right?
Pretty easy,
and there are many, yeah. And there are many reasons for that. Regulations is one, but then there are obviously a lot of different types of land ownership in New Mexico as well. Different industries work there as well, like potash and all. So all of that obviously plays a part. But generally speaking, you see that there's less of an impact and less of a liability sitting in New Mexico versus here in Texas. And that's something we need to pay attention to. And this is also not only important with inactive wells that are not plugged, but also with plugged wells. And we've seen stories around wells bubbling up, and that happens. Obviously, regulation changes over time, and rules tighten in response to certain events where we're learning more around what needs to be done and done better. But as those plugs age, and we know they're not made to be there forever, right? Then what are we looking at some point? Which plugs are the oldest that perhaps we need to keep an eye on? So that's a different topic, obviously.
Yeah. No, this is a hot topic, talking about orphan wells and inactive wells. And I can see from an A&D perspective, knowing what you have from an inactive well, whether they're TA'd, shut in, but especially this part about how long they've been TA'd and shut in, because a well that's been shut in 20 wells is a whole lot different than a well that's been shut in for a year. And the liability would probably be a little higher on the 20-year one. So it's, if I'm looking to acquire property or if I'm looking to sell property, this data is available. So it seems like to know what people are going to be seeing, there's probably value to that.
I agree. And this is especially of significant interest to ranch owners that are kind of looking at over time. We're just looking at a big ranch recently that are mostly working on cleanup, and they found it very interesting to see, okay, what are perhaps the priority areas that we should focus on first, or maybe the priority areas that we should keep a closer eye on as reclamation activities take place. And we're also not only talking about plugging the wells, but the land reclamation component of this is humongous. It's a huge effort that, in parts, more relevant than in some other parts, obviously, but nevertheless, another focus area for us to keep thinking about, think about a little more.
So you alluded to this earlier, but kind of you said second, third inning. you're looking to add additional modules or components to this. And I think you alluded to that earlier, but what do you have in mind kind of going forward?
So the next thing that's coming on is, as I mentioned, the EPA data, which is going to be available for benchmarking. And also we'll be using that data to fine tune some of our calculations around emissions. There's a lot of data there that we'll be integrating, as well as we want to start creating potential proxies, statistics-based proxies around companies that don't report, to see, okay, what, as a proxy, what does their holistic environmental footprint look like? We're also working on data in other environmental agencies that it'll give us an ability to interact with data around environmental norm violations. So emissions events, where are they happening? How often? How big? Are there any patterns there? Are they clustered somewhere? We'll be able to compare basins or operators, and that's quite important. I don't think we have that capability today to do that. And I think as a investor or as a mineral owner that's trying to decide who to lease their property to, maybe not in the Permian Basin because it's all leased up, but nevertheless, that's important intel. And once that data is available and decisions can be made based on that data, that's going to push the entire industry to improve if there are areas of concern to be pointed out.
You mentioned emissions, but what about spills, leaks, kind of other things like that?
I mean, that's part of the roadmap. We're starting with everything related to emissions. Next, we're moving to things related to leaks, spills. We're moving, in the roadmap, we have things around water, which is an important component. Obviously, we're capturing the inactive wells. We also want to do a little bit about land reclamation, which is an important component. And obviously, we're an ESG Dynamics company, so at some point, we want to talk about the social and governance components as well. We're focusing on that as perhaps our later phase. That's part of the 2022 roadmap. So there are a lot of things that over the next several quarters, we'll be integrating, a lot of active work ongoing. But we wanted to let our clients use the data we already have as soon as possible. So we didn't wait till we had a bigger module package. We went ahead and released what we have.
And you cover all of Texas and all of New Mexico, which, that's I don't know how much production comes from those two states, but it's a pretty healthy chunk. So you already cover quite a bit, it seems like. So, and so from an individual operator standpoint or a subscriber, then they would be able to just look at how they perform versus benchmarked other producers. They could use it for acquisitions. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what the application for this is.
Yes, correct. All of the above, as well as, when you think about certain metrics and certain organizations that have several layers of, bigger organization, obviously bigger hierarchy, why spend the company resources that are tailored towards perhaps other aspects of the industry to aggregate this data? Better go to the source that has aggregated it for you. And if I was an environmental manager with an operator, I'd be all over this just to ensure that we have our bases covered. Do we have areas where we should be reporting and not? What's our liability looking like? Does that align with what we have planned internally? And those are just quick checks, and this data is really easily consumable, such that I'd be definitely using it. We're also, for instance, with ranch owners, we're integrating their assets, their positions as an interactable, customized component of the tool. So they can easily filter down just to their asset and look at things that are relevant to them and not anything else. And again, that's just at a finger,
you're making that button. more complicated than my little head can handle. What do you mean by that? That you're showing the ranch and showing what's on there? Is that what you're talking about?
Correct. Pretty much.
There you go. See, I'm smarter than I look then. So you can layer in their land profile and show exactly what is happening on their land, not just in. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Fantastic. Good. Well, we have gone past our time. I know we've got quite a few questions that have come, but I urge you, if you have questions like this, to some of these might have kind of sent us down a path. So I urge you to get in touch with Gani so that he can have that dialogue with you offline. And this will be recorded on for our YouTube channel in the next day or so. It'll be posted on there. Gani, it sounds like you're more than open to having conversations with individuals if they have questions on this presentation. I know you have some other research on the website on Parsley and Pioneer, and then also the Shell Conoco acquisition. So there's some good reading there. So, well,
Absolutely.
good. Well, again, we go every first Wednesday of every month. So look for us next week. We'll be announcing our speaker shortly. And Gani, any closing thoughts? You want to take us home?
Again, Grant, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of this intel, some of these trends. I'm just happy to be here, and hopefully, we can be of help to folks around these metrics. We're spending a lot of time on this, so happy to have any conversations, answer any questions.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate y'all's time and interest in Oilfield Strong, OTA, and ESG Dynamics. Take care.